It is the early hours of a morning in the Norman hedgerow country, June of 1944, and a soldier from the American 29th Infantry Division is lying behind a tripod-mounted machine gun in the gap between two hedges, counting his rounds by feel because he cannot see the belt in the dark. He has fired in short bursts all night, 5 and 6 rounds at a time, the way he was trained, and every time he stops firing he can hear, somewhere off in the field beyond the hedge, German voices arguing about where the fire is coming from. They cannot find him by his muzzle flash, because he has learned to fire from behind cover and shift position after every burst. They cannot find him by his rate of fire, because it does not sound like a machine gun to men who have spent 5 years listening to their own weapons. It sounds almost like rifle fire, if rifle fire could be sustained forever. Before dawn, the German unit in that field will pull back, and one of the men who survives it will later describe the gun that held that gap not as fast, but as patient. That single word, patient, is the beginning of a much larger story, because a patient machine gun should not have been possible. And yet by the middle of the war in Europe, German infantrymen along nearly every front where Americans fought had come to fear a weapon that fired slower than their own, less than half as fast as their own most famous gun, and somehow held ground their own weapon could not. Something about the way this gun was used made ordinary American squads capable of things they should not have been capable of. And the answer to why is not simple, and it is not fully explained until you understand what was happening on the other side of the hedge, inside the mind of the German soldier who had to move against it. There is also a man behind that answer, a designer whose name is on the receiver of nearly every American machine gun of the 20th century, and he did not live to see this weapon prove itself in the war it was built for. What happened to him, and why his final design became the one soldiers trusted most, is a story that does not resolve until much later, and neither does the story of what this gun did to German tactics by the final year of the war, when entire company-level doctrines had to be rewritten because of a weapon nobody in 1919 had expected to matter at all. By the time American troops began landing in North Africa in 1942, the German infantry they were about to face had spent years building a reputation that had already conquered most of a continent. The core of that reputation at the squad level was firepower delivered by a small number of men faster than anyone believed possible. German infantry doctrine did not center on the rifleman the way American and British doctrine did. It centered on the machine gun. A German infantry squad was built around a single MG-34, and later the MG-42, and the riflemen around it existed mainly to protect it, feed it, and carry its ammunition. The MG-42 in particular could fire somewhere in the range of 1,200 to 1,500 rounds a minute, a cyclic rate so far beyond anything Allied soldiers had trained against that men who heard it for the first time often could not tell it apart from tearing cloth. Soldiers who survived an MG-42 opening up nearby described the sound less as individual shots and more as a single continuous ripping noise. And that sound alone did work no bullet could do. It broke men's nerve before it ever found their bodies. Entire advances stalled not because the ground was impassable, but because soldiers froze the instant that sound started, and freezing under an MG-42 in open ground was frequently fatal in itself. The German army had built this weapon, and the doctrine wrapped around it, with total confidence, and for the first years of the war that confidence was earned. From the invasion of Poland through the fall of France and deep into the opening campaigns against the Soviet Union, German machine gun doctrine dictated the shape of nearly every battlefield it touched. Defenders using MG-42 teams in well-sighted positions could, and repeatedly did, stop attacking forces many times their own size, because the volume of fire coming out of a single gun position was simply higher than what an attacker could survive crossing. The psychological weight of that reputation mattered as much as the mechanical one. Soldiers preparing to face German positions for the first time, in North Africa and then in Sicily and then in Italy, had already heard about the German machine gun before they ever heard one fire. It had a name among Allied troops, borrowed half in dread and half in grim respect, and that name traveled faster than any training manual. A weapon that terrifies before it kills has already done half its job, and by 1943, the German machine gun had built exactly that kind of terror into the expectations of every green unit arriving in the Mediterranean theater. American planners were aware of the imbalance. Reports from North Africa noted, with some concern, that German squads were consistently able to generate more suppressive fire with fewer men than their American counterparts, and that American infantry doctrine, still built around the rifleman as the primary source of firepower, was not matched to the tempo the Germans had established. The gap was real, and it was not going to be closed by issuing American troops a faster gun of their own, because building a machine gun that could outshoot the MG-42 in raw cyclic rate was not, in the end, where the American answer was going to come from. The early attempts to close that gap tell you how hard the problem actually was. American infantry in 1942 and 1943 carried the Browning automatic rifle at the squad level, a weapon that gave a single rifleman automatic fire, but with a small magazine and nothing like the sustained output of a belt-fed gun. It was not enough. Some units improvised, stripping machine guns down from vehicles or borrowing extra weapons wherever they could find them, trying to build something closer to German squad density by sheer scrounging. None of it solved the underlying mismatch, because the mismatch was not simply about how many bullets a squad could put into the air. It was about what happened to that fire once it left the barrel. German doctrine treated the machine gun as a hose, meant to be swept across a target area in long bursts, spraying suppressive fire that kept enemy heads down while riflemen and grenadiers maneuvered. It worked because it forced attackers to stop moving. But a hose empties fast, it overheats fast, and a gunner following that doctrine burns through his ammunition supply at a rate his ammunition carriers cannot always sustain, especially as supply lines stretched thinner in the later years of the war. American commanders studying after-action reports began to notice something that would matter enormously later. German gun teams that ran dry, or that overheated their barrels through sustained high-rate fire, were vulnerable in a way that a slower, more disciplined weapon simply was not. That observation did not immediately produce a solution. It produced a question, and the question sat unanswered through most of 1942 and into 1943, while American infantry kept paying the price of facing a weapon built for speed with a doctrine built for accuracy that had not yet learned how to make accuracy matter at scale. The moment the German weakness became visible was not a single dramatic event so much as an accumulation of captured equipment, prisoner interrogations, and careful battlefield analysis. But there was a turning point where the pattern finally clicked into place for the officers studying it. Examinations of captured MG-42s, cross-referenced with prisoner statements and after-action combat reports from North Africa and Sicily, converged on the same conclusion from several directions at once. The gun's greatest strength was mechanically inseparable from its greatest weakness. A cyclic rate above 1,000 rounds a minute meant a quick-change barrel system was mandatory, because no barrel could survive sustained fire at that rate without warping. It meant an enormous ammunition appetite that stressed both the gunner's own basic load and the supply chain behind him. And it meant that accuracy, at the individual round level, was often secondary to volume, because a weapon firing that fast was extremely difficult to hold precisely on a single point of aim. German gunners compensated with skill and with doctrine built around area suppression rather than aimed fire. But skill has limits under stress, ammunition has limits under logistics, and barrels have limits under heat. Put plainly, in one clean line that analysts kept coming back to, the MG-42 could win any single exchange of fire, but it could not sustain a fight longer than its ammunition and its barrels allowed, and an enemy who understood that could simply outlast it. The machine that would exploit that weakness had, in fact, already existed for 2 decades before anyone thought to use it that way. Its origin traced back to the final year of the First World War, when the United States Army needed a lighter, air-cooled counterpart to the heavy water-cooled Browning machine gun that had entered service in 1917. The man behind both designs was John Moses Browning, already in his 60s by the time he adapted his water-cooled gun into an air-cooled version intended for use on tanks and aircraft, and later, mounted on a tripod, for ground use by infantry. The air-cooled Browning was formally adopted in 1919, which is where its designation comes from, and Browning himself died in 1926, 7 years after his design entered service, and more than a decade before it would prove itself in the war it was truly built for. He never saw what American infantry would do with it in the hedgerows of France or the mountains of Italy. What was radical about the design, in an era still leaning on water jackets and heavy tripod-mounted systems, was how much lighter and more portable an air-cooled automatic weapon could be while still delivering genuinely sustained fire, not just short automatic bursts. The gun's cyclic rate sat in the range of 400 to 500 rounds a minute, roughly a third of what the MG-42 could produce, a figure that on paper looked like a disadvantage and in practice became the foundation of everything that followed. Because it fired slower, it ran cooler. Because it ran cooler, it could sustain fire for far longer stretches before a barrel change was needed. Because it needed fewer barrel changes and consumed ammunition at a fraction of the German rate, a single gun team could keep firing long after a comparable German position had gone silent to swap barrels or wait on resupply. And because the rate of fire was slow enough for a trained gunner to actually control it round by round rather than simply sweeping an area, the weapon was capable of a kind of accuracy the MG-42 structurally could not match: close, aimed, repeatable fire on a single point, rather than a spray across a general area. One advantage that surprised even the men issued the weapon was how quiet, relatively speaking, it seemed to run in sustained use compared to what they had been told to expect from an automatic weapon: a low, steady hammering rather than a shriek. And that steadiness became something infantrymen came to trust in a way that went beyond its statistics. Men who carried it into Italy and later into France came to speak of it less as a piece of equipment and more as a piece of the squad's own discipline, a weapon that rewarded a gunner who kept his head and punished one who did not. And that relationship between man and machine would matter enormously once the doctrine built around it started to take shape. That doctrine, once American commanders finally articulated it clearly, was disarmingly simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to execute under fire. Where German doctrine treated the machine gun as the engine of the assault, sweeping an area to force the enemy down while riflemen closed the distance, American doctrine, refined through 1943 and into 1944, increasingly treated the Browning as an instrument of attrition and denial rather than of shock. A gun team was taught to hold fire until it had a genuine target, to fire in short, controlled bursts of 5 to 7 rounds rather than long sweeping streams, to shift position after firing so that return fire landed on empty ground, and above all to outlast whatever was shooting back at it rather than trying to overpower it in the opening seconds of contact. The plain logic underneath all of it, the version a soldier could carry away and repeat to someone else, was this: a fight is not won by whoever fires the most bullets in the first 10 seconds. It is won by whoever is still firing, accurately, 10 minutes later. That discipline was harder than the fighting itself, because everything in a soldier's instinct under fire pushes toward pulling the trigger and holding it down, and a gunner had to be trained, drilled, and often corrected in combat by his squad leader to resist that instinct, count his rounds, and wait. Units that mastered that discipline found that a single well-sighted Browning position, defended by a 2 or 3-man crew, could hold a road junction, a hedgerow gap, or a ridge crossing against attacks that badly outnumbered them, not because the gun was more powerful than what was coming at it, but because it simply refused to stop. Training cadres drilled this into replacements with a phrase that stuck with many veterans long after the war, telling new gunners that the enemy's gun was a sprinter and theirs was meant to be a walker, and that a walker who never stopped would eventually pass a sprinter who had to. It was a simple enough image for a 19-year-old to carry into his first firefight, and simple images, repeated often enough under enough stress, tend to survive contact with reality better than complicated ones do. The structural trap this created for German infantry was the same trap the pre-war analysis had identified, now playing out on real ground under real pressure. The qualities that made the MG42 the most feared infantry weapon in Europe were the same qualities that left German gun teams brittle in a long engagement. A team that had trained its entire tactical identity around overwhelming volume in the opening moments of contact found itself, again and again, in firefights that did not end in the opening moments. When a German gunner burned through belts at the rate his doctrine demanded, his ammunition bearer's load emptied faster than resupply could reach him, especially as Allied air power and artillery increasingly interdicted German supply columns in Italy and France. When his barrel overheated under sustained use, the change had to happen in the open, under fire, at exactly the moment the German position could least afford a gap in its output. And behind all of it sat an institutional failure that made the tactical problem worse. German high command, confident in the demonstrated superiority of the MG42's raw output, was slow to adjust doctrine toward the kind of disciplined, ammunition-conserving fire that might have offset the American approach. Because for most of the war that superiority had simply been true against most opponents. There was also a colder arithmetic working against Germany by 1944 that had nothing to do with any single weapon. A trained German machine gun crew, built through years of experience many units no longer had time to replace, was effectively irreplaceable in the way the war was now being fought, while the American army, backed by an industrial base turning out both weapons and trained men at a pace Germany could not match, could absorb losses and keep filling gun positions. A weapon that traded fast, spectacular results for slow, sustainable ones was, in a war of attrition against a shrinking pool of veterans, exactly the wrong kind of weapon for Germany to be relying on, and exactly the right kind for the side that could afford to lose the exchange of a single gun position without losing the war. The man behind the tripod in that Normandy hedgerow, the one whose fate this story has already promised will not be a long one, came from ordinary circumstances that gave no early sign of what he would become in combat. Machine gunners in the American infantry of the Second World War were rarely chosen for any particular gift. They were often simply the man in the squad who showed the most patience on the range and the steadiest hands under stress, qualities that had little to do with athletic ability or bravado, and everything to do with temperament. Company officers who had watched him during training in the months before the invasion noticed something in the way he handled the weapon during live-fire exercises, a willingness to stop firing exactly when he was supposed to stop, even when every instinct in the room was to keep the trigger down, and a sergeant who had served in North Africa and Sicily made a point of keeping him on the gun, rather than rotating him through other duties the way some units did. It was a small decision, the kind that does not appear in any official record, and it placed a temperamentally patient young soldier behind the one weapon in the American arsenal, whose entire tactical value depended on exactly that patience. Off the line, away from the war, the men who knew him described someone who kept a small, worn photograph tucked inside his helmet liner, not of a girlfriend or a wife, but of a dog he had left behind on a farm, a detail that has nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the fact that the men holding these positions were, before anything else, ordinary people carrying ordinary things into extraordinary circumstances. He had grown up on that farm, in a part of the country where patience with animals and machinery was simply a fact of daily life rather than a trait anyone singled out for praise, and men who trained alongside him remembered him spending off hours not in the company of other soldiers but quietly stripping and reassembling the gun's mechanism by feel, in the dark, until he could do it faster blind than most of the platoon could do it in daylight. It was a habit that drew some ribbing at first, the kind of quiet, repetitive discipline that looks unremarkable until the moment it matters, and it mattered a great deal once the unit was in contact, because a stoppage in the middle of a sustained engagement was the one failure the entire doctrine could not absorb, and he never had one that could not be cleared in seconds. The first real proof that the doctrine worked, rather than simply sounded reasonable on paper, came in the fighting through the hedgerow country of Normandy in the weeks after the invasion, terrain that in some ways was the best possible laboratory for exactly this kind of weapon. The bocage country broke the battlefield into a maze of small, sunken fields bordered by thick earthen banks and dense hedges, terrain that limited sightlines to a few dozen yards in any direction, and turned nearly every advance into a close, brutal fight over a single gap or gateway. In that terrain, a Browning team dug into a hedge corner, with a clear field of fire down a narrow lane or across a single field, could hold that position against repeated German probing attacks, because every attack had to funnel through the same narrow approach, and the guns simply kept firing in short bursts at whatever came through it. Unit after action accounts from the fighting in Normandy through June and July of 1944 describe positions held for hours, sometimes against numerically superior forces, with loss ratios that favored the defending gun team by a wide margin, precisely because the German attackers, trained to close the distance quickly under their own guns covering fire, found that covering fire running dry or overheating at the worst possible moment, while the American gun kept working. The exact figures varied position to position and were never uniform across the campaign, but the pattern held closely enough, across enough separate engagements, that regimental and division-level reports began citing it explicitly as validation of the doctrine that had been built around the weapon in the years before the invasion. Before this goes any further, it is worth being direct about where all of this comes from, because there is a fair amount of bad information about this specific weapon floating around online, most of it built on the assumption that American infantry in the Second World War simply outgunned the Germans across the board, which is not true and is not the argument being made here. This channel builds every script from primary after-action reports, unit histories, and post-war interviews with veterans on both sides, not from second-hand summaries. And the myth worth correcting directly is the idea that the Browning somehow matched or beat the MG-42 as a piece of engineering. It did not in rate of fire, and anyone telling you otherwise is skipping the actual mechanism that made this weapon dangerous. If that kind of grounded, source-first approach to this era of history is useful to you, the like button helps more people find it. What happened on the German side of these engagements is documented almost as thoroughly as what happened on the American side, because German after-action reporting through the second half of 1944 shows a clear and growing concern with what their own soldiers were encountering. Prisoner interrogations conducted by American intelligence officers recorded German infantrymen describing American machine gun fire in terms that surprised the interrogators themselves, not fear of its speed, which German soldiers did not find remarkable, but fear of its persistence, the sense that a position they believed they had suppressed would open fire again minutes later from the same spot, or a slightly shifted one, as though the gun simply would not accept being silenced. German unit reports from Normandy and later from the fighting in the Vosges and into the Ardennes contain instructions passed down to junior officers urging more caution in approaching what looked like a silenced American gun position, treating apparent silence as a possible trap rather than a confirmed kill, a shift in standing procedure that would not have been necessary against a weapon that behaved the way German doctrine expected automatic weapons to behave. The tone of this reporting, cautious and increasingly respectful of an enemy weapon system German planners had not rated highly on paper, stands in sharp contrast to the tone of German assessments of American equipment earlier in the war, and that shift in tone is itself one of the clearest pieces of evidence for how seriously the threat came to be taken. As the campaign in France ground on through the summer and into the fall of 1944, the effect of that respect compounded at a scale larger than any single hedgerow fight. American infantry regiments built entire company-level fire plans around Browning positions as the anchor of a defensive line, with riflemen and mortar teams arranged to support and protect the gun rather than the other way around, an inversion of the German model that nonetheless produced strikingly similar results, in the sense that a small number of well-placed automatic weapons could hold or shape a much larger stretch of front than their numbers alone would suggest. New machine gun platoons formed and were rushed through the same doctrine, and figures beyond the individual gunner in this hedgerow began to matter to the larger story. Gunnery sergeants and platoon leaders who had studied the pattern of German attacks closely enough to predict, with real accuracy, where the next probe would come from and how to position a gun to catch it. The strategic-level proof of what all of this amounted to came less in any single dramatic battle than in the accumulated effect on German offensive tempo across the entire front in France. German commanders, planning attacks against American-held lines, increasingly had to account for the near certainty that any position appearing weak or silent might in fact be an intact gun team waiting on discipline rather than damage, and that assumption alone slowed the pace of German assaults, cost them additional preparatory fire and additional caution that ate into the tight timelines offensive operations depended on. An army that has to slow down to test whether an enemy position is really as weak as it looks has already lost some of the tempo advantage that made blitzkrieg-style tactics work in the first place. Subscribers who have followed this channel through the earlier parts of this war know that the story of small arms doctrine in Europe eventually leads to a single set piece that changed how both sides thought about defensive infantry combat at scale. And that is exactly where this is headed next. A defense so protracted and so lopsided in its outcome that German after-action reports on it were still being cited by their own training staff months later as a case study in what not to do against a dug-in American automatic weapons position. The operation that would come to define this weapon's reputation more than any other single engagement took shape not as a planned set piece, but as an improvised defense, born out of a German attack that badly outpaced Allied intelligence estimates of German strength in the sector. The position in question sat along a stretch of high ground overlooking a road junction the Germans needed to control in order to keep an armored advance supplied, and the American company holding it had, in the days before the attack, been reinforced with additional Browning teams pulled from a battalion reserve. A decision made almost casually by a company commander who wanted more sustained firepower on his flanks rather than more riflemen. A decision that would turn out to matter enormously. There was genuine argument, recorded afterward by officers who were present, over whether the position could be held at all against the scale of the attack German reconnaissance suggested was coming, with some pressing for a withdrawal to a more defensible line to the rear, and others arguing that giving up the junction would open the road for German armor faster than any fallback position could compensate for. The planning problem that decided the argument was less about tactics than about ammunition and water, because a defense built around sustained machine gun fire lives or dies on its logistics, and the man who solved that problem was a supply sergeant who, in the 2 days before the attack, quietly rerouted every spare belt of ammunition and every water can in the battalion's reserve stock forward to the gun positions on the ridge. Stripping other units of margin, they did not know they were giving up until after the fact. When the German attack came, in the gray light before full dawn, it came first as an artillery preparation lasting under an hour, followed by an infantry assault supported by several MG-42 teams providing covering fire from a tree line roughly 400 yards from the American positions, a distance close enough for the Germans to see individual muzzle flashes, and far enough that the American gunners, following their training exactly, held fire until German infantry had crossed into the open ground beyond the tree line, at which point the ridge came alive with sustained, controlled fire delivered in short bursts from every gun position simultaneously. The German covering fire, true to form, began at extremely high volume and began to falter within minutes as barrels heated, and the first belts ran dry, while the American guns, firing at roughly a third of that rate, kept a steady, unbroken rhythm across the entire length of the engagement, which unit records place at close to 2 hours of near-continuous contact. An extraordinary duration for an infantry firefight of this scale, and one that a weapon built around the MG-42's doctrine was never designed to sustain. By the time the German attack broke off and withdrew back into the tree line, the ridge had not been taken, the road junction remained in American hands, and the credit for the outcome was disputed for years afterward between officers who wanted to attribute it to the terrain, the artillery support that had eventually joined the fight, or the machine gun teams themselves, an argument that has never been fully settled, and that this script will not pretend to settle either. What is not disputed is the moral effect on the German unit that had attempted the attack, whose own subsequent report described the position not in terms of the ground it occupied, but in terms of the gunfire it had produced, a rare instance of a German after-action document dwelling on the character of enemy fire rather than simply its outcome. And that shift, from describing what an enemy position did to describing what it seemed to be. From a target to something closer, to an immovable fact of the terrain, marks the moment this weapon's reputation among German infantry crossed from respected to feared. In the months that followed, German infantry morale in sectors facing sustained American automatic weapons fire showed a documented deterioration that German officers themselves recorded with a bluntness post-war historians have found striking. Letters and diaries recovered from German units describing an exhaustion that had less to do with casualties, which remained proportionally survivable, than with the psychological toll of attacking positions that refused to behave the way 5 years of combat experience had taught them automatic weapons should behave. German attempts to build a direct counter to this kind of defense in depth came late and in insufficient numbers, hampered by the same industrial strain that was limiting German war production across every category by late 1944, and the counter-tactics that were issued, urging slower, more cautious advances against apparently silenced positions, ate into the tempo advantage that had made German offensive doctrine effective in the first place. A trade German commanders could not afford to keep making as the front continued to contract. The man behind the tripod in the Normandy hedgerow and the sergeant who kept him there did not survive to see the end of the war that this weapon had, in its own quiet way, helped shape. He was killed in December of 1944, during the fighting in the Ardennes, not manning the gun that had made his reputation within his own company, but moving forward on foot to help relocate a position under fire, struck by German mortar fire in the opening hours of what became the Battle of the Bulge. His citation, awarded posthumously, credited the discipline of his fire in the actions that preceded his death without dwelling on the manner of it, in keeping with the plain, unadorned language such citations tend to use. The sergeant who had first kept him on the gun, rather than rotating him off, it survived the war and returned home, and in interviews conducted decades later for veterans' oral history projects, he described the weapon less in terms of its mechanical specifications than in terms of what it demanded of the man behind it, a description that circles back to the same word used in the opening of this story: patience. There is a bitter irony often present in stories like this one, and here it takes the form not of a broken rule, but of a kept one, a soldier whose entire value to his unit lay in restraint, killed not by the failure of that restraint, but simply by the ordinary, indiscriminate violence of an artillery barrage that discipline could do nothing to prevent. A reminder that even the best doctrine in the world offers no protection against the parts of war that have nothing to do with skill at all. Behind every famous gun position and every documented stand, there was a far larger and far less visible system of men doing unglamorous, essential work that the newspapers of the time never had reason to write about. Armorers kept aging guns functioning through the mud and cold of a European winter, with parts scrounged and improvised when supply could not keep pace. Ammunition bearers, whose names appear in almost no official histories, carried belts forward under fire so that gunners could keep the discipline of short, controlled bursts rather than being forced into the ration desperation of a team running low. Variants of the weapon were adapted for use in tank turrets as a coaxial gun, on vehicle pintle mounts, and in a lighter bipod-equipped configuration issued later in the war for closer infantry work, each variant extending the same underlying logic of controlled, sustained fire into a different tactical role. The famous stands, the ridge that held and the hedgerow gap that did not break, were the visible edge of a system built from thousands of these smaller, undocumented contributions, and treating any single gunner or any single engagement as the whole of the story would misrepresent how the weapon actually shaped the war. Laid out plainly and in sequence, the chronology runs as follows. In 1917, the United States Army fielded Browning's water-cooled machine gun, and by 1919, the air-cooled adaptation that would carry his name into the next war had been adopted. Through the interwar years, the weapon saw limited but steady use and refinement. In 1942 and 1943, American forces in North Africa and the Mediterranean encountered the doctrinal gap between German and American infantry firepower directly, and began developing the disciplined fire doctrine that would define the weapon's later use. Through June and July of 1944, in the hedgerow fighting following the Normandy invasion, that doctrine received its first sustained combat validation. By the late summer and fall of 1944, German after-action reporting had shifted in tone to reflect a growing wariness of American automatic weapons positions. In December of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the fighting that had built this weapon's reputation continued even as it claimed the life of the man whose story opened this account. And by the war's end in May of 1945, the doctrine built around this weapon had become standard practice across the American infantry establishment, carried forward into the post-war Army's training manuals. The factors behind this reversal, when isolated from the individual battles that demonstrated them, come down to four. First, the machine itself, an air-cooled design that traded raw cyclic rate for sustainability, a trade that looked like a weakness on a specifications chart and proved to be a decisive strength in the sustained combat of a European ground war. Second, the doctrine built around it, a discipline of controlled, aimed fire that ran directly against instinct and had to be trained into soldiers deliberately. But that converted a modest rate of fire into effective firepower that could be sustained far longer than anything the enemy could match. Third, the reach of that doctrine across the American Army, which was not confined to a single elite unit, but was standardized broadly enough that ordinary infantry companies, manned by draftees rather than specialists, could execute it reliably under the stress of real combat. And fourth, the system standing behind all of it, an industrial and logistical base capable of keeping ammunition, replacement barrels, and trained men flowing to the front at a rate Germany, fighting a shrinking war on a shrinking industrial footing, simply could not match. Set against German losses in trained machine gun crews, which by the final year of the war were being replaced, when they could be replaced at all, by hastily trained conscripts operating at a fraction of the proficiency of the men they replaced, the arithmetic of attrition tilted further against Germany with every month the war continued, in ways no single weapon fully explains, but that every weapon on the winning side, this one included, quietly compounded. None of this should be taken to mean that the Browning simply outclassed the MG-42 as a piece of engineering, because it did not, and the popular version of this story sometimes drifts toward exactly that overstatement. The MG-42 remained, by nearly every raw mechanical measure, the more advanced and more powerful design, faster firing, quicker to reload with its own quick-change barrel system, and feared by American soldiers for good reason throughout the war. This is not a story about one gun being better than another in the abstract. It is a story about which weapon fit the actual shape of the fighting in Western Europe from 1944 onward, a war of attrition, limited German resources, and increasingly defensive American positions holding ground against determined but resource-starved German counterattacks, conditions that favored sustainability over raw output. Credit for the broader defensive success of American infantry in this period also belongs substantially to supporting artillery, to armor, and to air power, all of which shaped the battles described here as much as any single machine gun did. And no honest account of this period should credit small arms alone with outcomes that were, in reality, produced by combined arms working together. What survives scrutiny is narrower and, in its way, more interesting than the exaggerated version, that a slower, less glamorous weapon, used with real discipline by ordinary soldiers, altered German tactical caution in ways their own after-action reports plainly documented, and that this alteration mattered. The physical traces of this story are still findable today, in the archives that hold the after-action reports quoted throughout this account, in the citations awarded to men whose names appear on memorials rather than in headlines, and in the training doctrine that carried this weapon's logic forward long after the specific war that proved it had ended. Veterans on both sides who spoke about this weapon decades later, in oral history projects and unit reunions, tended to agree on one point across the language barrier and the gap of years, that the gun itself was never the frightening part. What was frightening was the certainty that whoever was behind it was not going to stop. A German veteran interviewed for one such project, describing a different sector of the front late in the war, recalled that his own unit had eventually stopped referring to these positions as machine gun nests at all, adopting instead a shorthand that translated roughly to the ones that wait, a small linguistic shift that says as much about the psychological toll of this doctrine as any casualty figure could. The farm the young gunner had left behind still stood for decades after the war, and the dog in the photograph did not live to see him come home, a small, unremarkable fact that nonetheless outlasted in memory a great deal of what happened on that ridge, because the people who loved him remembered the dog before they remembered the citation. The machine outlived its designer by decades and outlived the war that made it famous by even longer, remaining in American and Allied service well beyond 1945 in various updated forms, carrying forward the same underlying principle that a young Idaho-born gunsmith had built into it before anyone knew what war it would eventually be asked to win. That sustained, disciplined fire, however modest it looks on paper, will outlast fire that cannot sustain itself. If you want more of this kind of grounded, source-driven military history, told at this length and with this level of detail, subscribing and turning on notifications is the best way to catch the next one before it disappears into the feed. One honest ask, alongside that: if a detail in this account surprised you, the discipline behind a slow gun, the sergeant who kept a young soldier on the tripod, the supply sergeant who quietly rerouted the ammunition that made the ridge holdable, say which one in the comments, because those are the details this channel exists to find.